The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to Jerry Nadler.
Pistol, it can become a short-barreled rifle, and then it's subject under the National Firearms Act. That's what you're saying.
Dettelbach is the director of ATF. Do you agree with President Biden?
No one in this caucus condones serious assaults against law enforcement officers.
Red flag arm bill unlikely to pass Senate. A red flag bill that would enable families, police, and others to request that federal courts order the seizure of arms from persons who pose a serious risk to themselves or others was adopted by the House. It's the most recent Democratic answer to the horrific crime incidents in the U.S., yet the Senate is unlikely to pass it. The District of Columbia, 19 states, and these red flag statutes are now in force. A court might order the temporary removal and storage of the arms under the House bill until a hearing could be held to decide whether the arms should be returned or retained for a certain amount of time. On a 224 to 202 primarily party line vote, the bill was approved. Representative Gerald Nadler, the Democratic head of the House Judiciary Committee, said, "We are painfully aware that no one answer will solve that problem. But we do know that taking arms out of the hands of people who pose a danger to themselves or to others would save countless lives." The vote happened after an emotional week that saw victims of recent mass casualty incidents in Uvalde, Texas, and Buffalo, New York, testify before Congress. It also happened before a march for stricter arm laws that is scheduled in Washington. The House passed a comprehensive arm control measure that will increase the minimum age requirements for acquiring a semi-auto arm and outlaw the sale of ammunition mags that can hold more than 15 rounds. In the Senate, it is also essentially no chance. The red flag bill was attacked by House Republicans for granting the federal government the authority to seize a law-abiding person's arms without giving them the opportunity to challenge the confiscation in advance. Rep. Mike Johnson, a Republican from Louisiana, said, "It would allow the courts to take arms away from people without notice, and without even the right to appear in a hearing to defend themselves in court." The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the law would result in the filing of approximately 10,000 emergency petitions with the courts each year. Additionally, the bill would establish a grant program at the U.S. Department of Justice to support the 19 states that already have red flag laws in place and urge additional states to do the same. Reps Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, Anthony Gonzalez of Ohio, Chris Jacobs of New York, Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, and Fred Upton of Michigan were among the 5 Republicans who supported the measure. Only Fitzpatrick is running for office again. Only one Democrat, Rep. Jared Golden of Maine, cast a vote against it. Democratic Reps Salud Carbajal of California and Lucy McBath of Georgia were the bill's primary sponsors. Their son, Jordan Davis, was put down in 2012 at a gas station in Jacksonville, Florida, by a white man who was upset about the loud music the teenager of color and his friends were playing in their car.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to Jerry Nadler.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Director, in 2012, John Spencer, Chief of Firearms Technology Branch.
There have been a variety of balanced budget amendments that have been considered by Congress, but among the many troubling...
That's right. Under this bill, a conviction is not required. This will lead to bizarre consequences.
President Joe Biden vehemently backs the legislation. According to the White House, this will make significant progress toward keeping arms out of dangerous hands. However, it is unclear that the bill will move forward in the Senate, where it would require the support of at least 10 Republican senators. Senators are instead concentrating on small-scale policy reforms through a system that would give money and other incentives to states in order to increase security on school campuses, offer more mental health services to children, and potentially even encourage states to explore red flag laws on their own. Senator John Cornyn of Texas, who is presiding over negotiations on behalf of the Republicans, stated that one area of emphasis is expanding the NICS background check system to cover young buyers' criminal histories before the age of 18. The NICS system should include juvenile records, according to Cornyn, to ensure we have a complete picture of the buyer's history. He expressed hope that senators would come to a compromise. "If there is a will, there is a way around here, and I think we do have the will and we will find a way," Cornyn added. The House is prepared to debate a Senate-sponsored arm control package, according to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, if it's life-saving and can make a difference. But she issued a warning. "We cannot tolerate deceit. They cannot claim that the situation is about this or that. No, the issue is arms. Chairman Nadler advocates ban. Gerald Nadler, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, made the following statements during a markup of the attack arms ban of 2021. Today, we advance historic legislation aimed at preventing armed crime. H.R. 1808, the Attack Arms Prohibition Act of 2021, amends and restates the previous attack arms prohibition, which prevented arms of war from entering our communities for 10 years before Republicans blocked its renewal. Attack arms are the go-to arm for mass incidents, as we have all too recently discovered, especially when coupled with high-capacity mags. These military-style arms are made to slay as many people as possible quickly. Simply said, they have no business being on our streets. We outlawed these slaying devices in 1994, saving countless lives, but 10 years later we let the prohibition expire. Since then, we have observed the expected outcomes: an exponential rise in the number of mass incidents and an increased vulnerability of our public places to attack, including schools, movie theaters, supermarkets, places of worship, parades, etc. It's time to once more forbid them in order to safeguard our communities. Semi-auto attack rifles and large-capacity ammunition feeding mechanisms would be illegal to sell, manufacture, transfer, or possess under the Attack Rifles Ban Act. It also includes several safeguards for law enforcement and responsible arm owners, including hunters, arm collectors, farmers, sport shooters, and others who use arms for self-defense. At the same time, it grandfathers existing semi-auto attack arms. Our Republican allies will surely use a multitude of justifications to argue against removing these lethal arms from our streets. But it's crucial to take into account discussion in the context of our other initiatives to combat the crime ravaging our neighborhoods. Democrats have repeatedly advanced sensible arms safety legislation only to run into opposition from Republicans who support the radical agenda of the arm industry.
Pistol, it can become a short-barreled rifle, and then is subject under the National Firearms Act. That's what you're saying.
No one in this caucus condones serious assaults against law enforcement officers.
Some liability exemption for their COVID vaccines, right?
I actually am not familiar with vaccines.
Wow.
And Mr. Bosco, I think before this committee, said that people were using stabilizing braces in ways that he hadn't anticipated.
We have introduced bipartisan legislation in this committee to require background checks on all arms sales. On the Judiciary Committee, our Republican co-workers were against it. To close the Charleston loophole and provide law enforcement enough time to run a background check, we advanced legislation. Our committee's Republican members were against it. We put forward legislation to shut the boyfriend loophole, which would prevent domestic offenders from having access to arms. Republican colleagues of ours were against it. We advanced legislation to use extreme risk protection orders to prevent people who pose a threat to others or themselves from having access to arms. Republican colleagues of ours disagreed. I introduced the Protecting Our Kids Act in response to the mass incidents in Buffalo and Uvalde, which would raise the legal buying age for some semi-auto rifles to 21, outlaw straw purchases, mandate safe storage, and outlaw large-capacity mags, bump stocks, and ghost arms. Bipartisan backing helped this bill pass the House, but the majority of Republicans, including all of our Republican committee colleagues, were against it. Some of these similar provisions were included in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which we advanced. The majority of our Republican colleagues were against it. We advanced legislation to give law enforcement additional tools to solve homicides, lowering retaliatory shootings, and reducing armed crime by locking up slayers. The majority of our Republican committee colleagues were against it. As we advanced legislation to offer law enforcement a tool to properly alert the public when there is an active shooter, we did so with the understanding that despite our best efforts, we cannot prevent all instances of armed crime. Even though this legislation was supported by both parties on the House floor and by a number of law enforcement organizations, the majority of our Republican committee colleagues rejected it. And now we come to our markup. Will our Republican colleagues decide to support those arms that mass slayers and those who want to attack law enforcement favor? Will they decide to support arms made to end as many people as possible in the most effective way? Or will they decide to stand up for worried parents who fear getting the news that their child was harmed in class? Will they decide to stand up for Americans who merely want to go shopping, participate in a parade, or visit a movie theater without worrying about being a target? Will they decide to clear the streets of military equipment? I want to congratulate Congressman Cicilline for his efforts in getting this legislation forward. For me, it is an easy decision. I implore my colleagues to stand with me in approving this crucial piece of legislation that will shield Americans from armed crime. Supreme Court invalidates invalidation. The concealed carry legislation in New York, which has been in effect since 1913, has been declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. The judgment, a 6-3 decision with conservative justices in the majority, has prompted states with comparable legislation and other regulations that may conflict with the court's more expansive interpretation of Second Amendment rights to scramble to safeguard both arm rights and public safety. The concealed carry permit statute in New York State is the subject of the case New York State Rifle and Arm Association versus Bruin. Residents must obtain a permit from the state in order to carry an arm in public, and applicants must provide proof of a good reason for doing so. One man requested a permit for self-defense, while the other did so in response to a wave of robberies in his neighborhood. The law in New York was invalidated by the Supreme Court because it went against both the Second and 14th Amendments. They made it clear that the Second Amendment preserves the right to openly carry an arm. They also established a new standard by which courts will judge whether a statute infringes on the Second Amendment. The District of Columbia versus Heller case from 2008, the first time the Supreme Court acknowledged an individual's right to own an arm, serves as the beginning point for this test's historical context. State regulation of arms is permitted by the Second Amendment, but only to a certain extent. The discretionary component of the statute cannot exist under state law, although states may still need permits for carrying arms in public. This concurring opinion suggests that states and the federal government have the authority to restrict the right to carry arms.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Dettelbach, the pistol brace is an accessory, right?
Dettelbach, as the director of ATF, do you agree with President Biden?
Well, I've got here the actual original brace that this letter was responsive to,
in which someone who had no intent of harming a law enforcement officer, but nevertheless committed an act that constituted assault,
which is similar to Justice Scalia's Heller ruling from 2008. The dissenting judgment placed a greater emphasis on public health, citing research from the social sciences and public health scholarship that highlights the significance of taking into account the effects of arms and armed crime on public health. When asked why the Buffalo incident occurred if New York's law was excellent, Justice Alito ignored the public health data. The main lessons from this opinion are more focused on public health because laws like New York's that require justification will no longer be in place, and those laws are unpopular for public health reasons. Arm restrictions, even those with solid empirical support, may face many more challenges as a result of the Second Amendment's expansion to include matters beyond the home and the new test for the Second Amendment. The contentious arm control law known as Massachusetts Bill HD 4420 is anticipated to pass in the Commonwealth. The measure mandates serializing and registering periodicals through a real-time electronic system developed by the Department of Criminal Justice Information Services, as well as background checks for all arms and feeding apparatuses. The database for access to personal property will be updated to include this registration process. The Ware, Massachusetts Police Department issued a warning that the bill treats law-abiding citizens as criminals rather than criminals, making it more challenging for law enforcement to deal with actual crime. Local police departments have expressed grave concerns about the bill. The state assembly is unaware that a dictatorial government sought to take away arms from its citizens more than 200 years ago, setting off a revolution. Dana A. Flynn, the chief of Plymouth, Massachusetts, urged lawmakers to abandon the measure, saying that conversation and public involvement are crucial for drafting laws that take into account the various concerns and perspectives of people. The Ware Police Department and the National Shooting Sports Foundation have joined forces to voice their adamant opposition to HD 4420, a proposed arm restriction bill that has greatly alarmed the community. The proposal to grant the state attorney general the power to direct state police to seize all arms produced after 1994 is one of the more contentious clauses. Law-abiding arm owners are concerned that their legally acquired arms might be seized without adequate due process or justification. The measure also suggests that arm owners notify the government if they modify their arms, even if the change is minor, such as adding optics or a sling to a hunting rifle. Arm owners complain that this regulation is burdensome and adds unnecessary bureaucracy without significantly enhancing public safety. Another unsettling proposal is to serialize, register, and compel police notification upon loss, theft, or destruction of any mag. Arms rights supporters argue that this level of regulation places a significant burden on law-abiding citizens without addressing the root causes of armed crime. The bill's attempt to restrict downloadable arm code from the internet has drawn criticism for potentially violating the First Amendment. Hunters are concerned that they won't be able to hunt on their own land unless it has been designated as being open to carrying arms. Law enforcement officers who are not on duty are also not exempt from this rule, making it impossible for them to carry arms and respond to emergencies. Impact on arm rights and legislation. The U.S. Supreme Court's most significant ruling on arms in more than a decade was the overturning of a New York legislation that restricted people's ability to carry arms. In the midst of a heated national discussion on the subject, this judgment increases arm rights and is anticipated to enable more people to carry arms lawfully. 1/4 of Americans reside in states that would be impacted if their own arm laws are overturned. The court determined that a New York law requiring residents to demonstrate proper cause, a valid justification, in order to carry concealed arms in public is unconstitutional. Justice Clarence Thomas declared that citizens had the right to carry commonly used arms in public for personal protection in a dissenting opinion on behalf of the court's majority of 6 conservative members. The ruling opens the door for legal challenges to limitations of a similar nature in Massachusetts, Maryland, California, New Jersey, Hawaii, and Maryland. Political disagreements about how to deal with armed crime are at an all-time high following high-profile slayings at a primary school in Uvalde, Texas, and a grocery store in Buffalo, New York. The decision was made after the U.S. Senate approved new measures that would restrict access to arms. The Supreme Court's ruling, according to President Joe Biden, contravenes both common sense and the Constitution and should trouble us all, leaving him deeply disappointed, he said. Mayor of New York City Eric Adams said he will examine additional measures to limit access to arms, such as tightening the requirements for obtaining permits to purchase arms and considering prohibitions in specific areas. The decision was applauded by the NRA. Robert Nash and Brandon Koch, 2 New Yorkers who requested for concealed carry permits but were denied them despite having licenses for recreational arm ownership, were supported by the arm lobby in their legal battle. In the U.S., there are more than 390 million civilian arm owners, and more than 45,000 Americans lost life in 2020 from arm-related wounds, including self-hurt. The constitutionality of a federal legislation enacted in 1994 that restricts the possession of arms by those who are actively covered by a domestic crime restraining order will be debated by the Supreme Court.
Questioning would have been grounded in advancing and overseeing the FBI's dual missions of enforcing federal laws and
decisions that have massive economic impacts and have major impacts on the lives of the American people. With all due respect to the ranking member,
necessary for the patient. The doctor says it is. Why shouldn't the VA hospital crimes and prevent gun violence? They would hear nothing about how the department is disrupting efforts by Russia, China, and others. So I would ask you why this is not a limiting amendment. Why this, in what way this expands the...
And that is pass some gun reform legislation to keep our communities safe.
The judges took into account the Supreme Court's ruling from the previous year and came to the conclusion that Rahimi's Second Amendment right to bear arms was not violated, even though he discharged his arm 5 times in public over the course of 2 months while under a restraining order. A bill known as the Disarm Hate Act was introduced to address the issue of those convicted of hate crimes having access to arms. Critics expressed concerns about potential violations of Second Amendment rights, while supporters claim that it is an important step in the fight against hate-related crime. Numerous organizations have backed the measure, demonstrating a wide range of support for its goals. Its adoption and use, however, are still hotly contested issues. A long-standing New York law was overturned by the Supreme Court's decision in New York State Rifle and Arm Association, Inc. versus Bruin last year, which found that Americans had the right to carry arms in public for self-defense. After a few days, state lawmakers reconvened to expand New York's red flag laws, which permit police to seize a person's arms if they represent a threat to themselves or others. In June of last year, lawmakers swiftly amended the state's concealed carry law, reducing the number of authorized public venues for carrying arms and tightening the requirements for acquiring a permit. Supporters of stricter arm control regulations in the state, like Fisher, say the ruling might have an impact on how courts assess arm laws and whether or not arm laws statewide are still viewed as constitutional under the Second Amendment. In federal court, the amended concealed carry law is being contested. The stricter control, in the opinion of Second Amendment rights advocates like Texas Rifle and Arm Association Executive Director Tom King, may lead to the illegal confiscation of a person's arms. The Supreme Court's ruling will assist to explain last year's arm rights ruling and lay out the new guidelines for judges around the nation when making decisions on legal challenges to existing arm restrictions. The new ruling will provide some clarity to the evaluation of arm laws, according to the conflicting interpretations of Bruin being used by courts at the moment. In the future, judges will have greater direction on what types of historical laws should be used to support arm regulations if they utilize a law that is comparable to federal laws, qualifies as historical law, and fits within the new framework of analysis. King is certain that the state's law-abiding arm owners will be ready to follow the court's ultimate decision regardless of the outcome. They are the highest court in the country, he proclaimed. Arm owners, unlike Governor Kathy Hochul, who was unable to accept the Bruin decision, will be able to accept whatever decision the Supreme Court makes. Legislators fought hard for a number of the laws that were passed before the session was over. These included legislation to increase Medicaid payments for crime prevention programs, enact the Grieving Families Act, and tighten the state's victims' compensation law. Hochul has until the end of the year to decide whether to enact them. Fisher claims that she has not expressed her thoughts on the measures or if she intends to sign the bills. In conclusion, it is important to note that the Disarm Hate Act was introduced as a piece of legislation to address the problem of those convicted of hate crimes having access to arms. Critics express concerns about potential violations of Second Amendment rights, while supporters claim that it is an important step in the fight against hate-related crime. Although the measure has received sponsorship from a number of organizations demonstrating broad support for its goals, its passage and implementation are still up for discussion.
So anxious to change the language of the underlying legislation is because of the last sentence that I just read you, that last clause, because...
But now you secretly let out what the real purpose of it is. It's to claim that Democrats want to defund...
Simple. I will read, if I can find underneath all these amendments.
Striking a clause in the preamble is per se germane, neither adds nor subtracts, and police...
We took up bills for National Police Appreciation Week. We took up the actual bills.
This protocol was not controversial. It was a helpful tool we used to manage hearings and make sure videos played.
Analyzing proposals for arm control. We delve into a discussion of various arm control proposals recently presented by a Democratic representative from New Mexico. The motivation behind these proposals appears to be rooted in a controversial incident involving Governor Grisham's actions. While some may view these measures as necessary steps to enhance public safety, others may perceive them as propaganda for arm control. The crux of the matter revolves around the assertion that armed crime is the leading cause of death among children in the U.S. This assertion, while passionately made, is not without its critics, who argue that it is built on flawed or misleading information. In this context, we aim to provide a comprehensive breakdown of the proposed measures and their potential implications. One of the key proposals is the implementation of a federal red flag law, which would enable courts to prevent individuals deemed a danger to themselves or others from obtaining arms or new attack arms. Additionally, the proposal includes the reintroduction of universal background checks on arms, akin to the regulations in place from 1994 to 2004. Furthermore, there is a push to close what is known as the Charleston loophole, which allows the FBI to indefinitely delay arm acquisition. This development could further centralize efforts to enforce and oversee these regulations, consolidating the government's role in arm-related issues. In conclusion, the proposed arm control measures, when examined together, present a comprehensive strategy that seeks to address concerns about armed crime. However, the potential implications for individual rights, due process, and privacy should be carefully considered and debated. Understanding the full scope of these measures is crucial to making informed decisions about their implementation and impact on society. That's all for this video, folks. Thank you so much for watching our video today, and we will see you the next time.